My name is Victor. As Val mentioned, I am an account executive for Sucuri. We're going to talk on a number of things today, and one of the few takeaways that I'm hoping everyone has an opportunity to absorb is first, the ability to reduce your attack surface for your e-commerce site. Best practices for protecting the cardholder data that you're likely taking in, as well as making sure that you have a proper disaster recovery plan set up for your website. Now, in terms of who these types of topics are for, well, for the most part, this webinar will be catering to self-hosted stores. So if you're deploying some type of content management system, such as Magento or WooCommerce or WordPress as an example, you're going to probably take a lot of takeaways from this at every stage of the webinar. But having said that, if you are also utilizing an online presence through other means, like a closed platform, for example, there are probably good practices as well that'll be good for your entire organization as a whole. Now, typically, when we do these webinars, we always like to, provide some insight into who we are before we talk about what we do. So one thing to note is if you've seen a couple of our webinars before, I've had done some in the past, so it's going to be more additional insight into sort of my day-to-day life. So my last webinar, I touched on the fact that I had brought in 2 new kittens. That's who they were back in April. To give you insight who they are now, they are there on the left-hand side. So for those cat lovers, that I'm pleasantly surprised how big they're getting. So any insight that you have to share with me on that, by all means, hit me on Twitter for that. Pulled pork sandwiches are an auto order for me at any restaurant. So if you're a restaurateur, by all means, hit me up as well. Would love to taste wherever you have. And this is my 5th Sucuri webinar. It took me by surprise when I got that nugget the other day. So I think I'm the first to hit 5. Ideally, hopefully, I'm the first to hit 10 too. So we'll see about that. So why we're here. A lot of what we've seen in terms of emphasis going into now the later part of 2018 is more about addressing a lot of risk when it comes to your online presence, and in specific, a lot of online stores that are collecting all kinds of data. With GDPR coming into place into the the later part of May and June earlier this year, that became a higher priority of a topic, and so I thought maybe addressing data and e-commerce security as a whole might be a benefit, and especially as we go into 2019, where a lot of these attacks that are targeting e-commerce shops definitely are growing in scale. Now, one of the first things you sort of have to do when it comes to evaluating what type of security measures one should take is first analyzing and essentially reducing your attack surface. What does that mean? Well, it's essentially evaluating your exposure, right? What do you have, and how available is it, and what type of upkeep are you keeping with the kind of components and software you're using to run your online store. So first things first, when you talk about any extensions or plugins that you're using, do you absolutely need it? Okay, I think sometimes we get a little bit click happy in terms of going and seeing new features or new forms or integrations, and we start installing things left and right. But when it comes to basically owning up to the responsibility of making sure that all of our visitors and consumers and clients are safe when visiting our site, we have to be a bit more hardline in understanding, are we using what we absolutely need? Okay. Beyond that, we have to also understand what happens if a vulnerability is disclosed. So what happens when something does happen with an open source platform, right? Whether it's a Magento specific disclosure or plugin against WordPress that's been recently found with some new tactic that's being exploited. What are we doing, right? Or what actions are we taking? Are we even aware? Are we or do we have some type of insight into, let's say, a feed or a blog that provides a type of information? No, we do provide some updates on our blog about important security disclosures. So just having visibility into that is going to be another thing about understanding your attack surface as a whole, and making sure you can help reduce that risk. The next thing to understand is, of course, here is what developers are doing in terms of prioritizing security measures. when we do understand what components we absolutely need, are we seeing that developers are updating it frequently? Or are we installing something that hasn't been updated or touched in about 8 months, right? So understanding, of course, the quality of the component or the extension or plugin that you're using is just as crucial, because we want to make sure that the people that we're working with, right? As we install new themes and plugins, we're depending on these authors to continue to upkeep this software so that our sites are running not only functionally but safely. So making sure that that they are keeping up to date with at least recent updates, and auditing their own code, seeing of course that there are a lot of downloads to begin with, meaning of course it's trusted among a large base. I'd rather have the plugin that's downloaded 20,000 times versus the one that's only been downloaded 20 times. So just a bit of a nugget there for you as well. And mentioning, of course, do you have a plan when these updates are released, right? So this sort of touches on the second question, right? What happens if a vulnerability is disclosed? So you have insight into knowing, okay, great, there is a new security disclosure, and great, developer has pushed out a new update. Well, do we have a plan in place to either automate or delegate the task to someone internally to ensure that those updates are applied? And not just apply, but of course, you also want to ensure that those updates, when made, don't cause any disruption in the operation of the site. So you want to look out for bugs or anything like that. So even from just a security standpoint, you also want to make sure the tools that you're using are working properly. Now, those are some of the key aspects, right? So, sort of the notes I hit on with here is about making sure that you're leveraging a lot of core functionality, things that are made for WordPress or for Magento or anything like that, versus some weird third-party tool that's on some website that might have been torrented somewhere just because maybe you were trying to cut costs. If the third party is an option, make sure that whatever you do download, as I mentioned, has a reputable source. So a lot of downloads, high ratings, recently updated. Those are the kind of things you want to look for. And as well as making sure that the ones you do end up keeping and using on an ongoing basis continue to be reliable, secure, and supported. Okay. Now, that's just, of course, maintaining visibility over that. But from a proactive standpoint, those measures aren't going to necessarily, block threats or minimize risk or exposure. They help give you insight, doesn't necessarily help you from defending against those threats. So what should one do when protecting your online store? Well, first things first, of course, is just establishing importance of, of having secure payments processed through your site, right? Last thing we want is, our clients complaining that they think that their credit card information was stolen through our website, right? So, that gets into a lot of other things. So to ensure the integrity and the trust of your consumers, we want to sort of go through this checklist of things so that we know that we're doing our best. And more importantly, if you probably caught on by now, is making sure that you're also compliant with all the regulations that are out there to make sure that data is safe. PCI DSS, GDPR. So I'll go through this list briefly, but a lot of it does seem, it does seem common sense, but you would be surprised by how many times people neglect to answer one of these questions. First thing, of course, is what type of information are we collecting? So just understanding the inventory of data that we're asking of people to enter into our website. Credit cards, passwords, names, addresses, zip codes, anything that could identify someone personally are the type of information we need to know that we are collecting. Who has access to this information and who should? Two different questions, right? Because we do have, let's say, sysadmins that should have access to this data, does not necessarily mean that the front clerk wouldn't just as easily be able to access that when they realistically don't have any reason to. So also understanding who has that access and establishing roles within your team as well is important. If someone does access the information, whether they were supposed to or not, are those events recorded? So that way, if something happens, we have some type of history that we can backtrack against and then better understand what happened and when. Now, in terms of course, the act of processing of payments, are we ensuring that the data is protected in transit? Or in other words, are we using a valid SSL certificate on the site? And one thing we want to make sure of is, of course, it's a valid certificate. don't try to use self-signed certificates. Browsers are likely not to trust them. And of course, you're not going to be then entrusted with the green padlock there, which of course, if it's not there and you're asking for payment or information, people are a bit more conscious these days in knowing, well, padlock's not there, it's asking for info. I don't know if I should really submit this info here. Are you monitoring that data properly, right? So knowing exactly where the data is, how long are you storing it for? These are just some of the questions. What level does your business fall with specific to PCI compliance, right? Are you a level 1, a level 2 provider? What specific things do you have to do to ensure you maintain that compliance? That's a different conversation, but just something to make sure that you have some insight into. And are any changes to the site being logged as well? Now, this isn't data specific, but any changes to the site, i.e. to the files, database, your DNS, anything that is a misstep along that workflow could potentially result in a data breach, which is why it's important to know. So if there are changes to the site that allow for open access, right? Let's say global write access to all of your files, that's a pretty risky proposition. And then knowing when those changes were made can allow us to revert back to either a backup of some sort. So it gives us time to fix the problem. Now, this is important because part of those requirements within more specific to PCI is understanding the intent of the what, the who, where, and when of people accessing your data resources, right? It's really important. We're sharing a lot of information these days online. It's really easy for us to save our info through our mobile browser, and it autofills, and boom, it takes all of half a second for us to think about that we're sending information on the web. So it's really important that also we maintain a really good understanding of all access points when it comes to data. Now, what data are we talking about in specific, right? I mentioned what data are we, as a business are you taking care of, but what data are you responsible for, period? Well, it does depend on what regulations you're expecting to follow. Now, this is a topic I approached via webinar and blog before, but under GDPR, the one thing to note is that personal data essentially means any bit of information that can identify me. So whether that's my location, whether that is my sex, whether that is my address, phone number, anything that can identify me is something that as a business, I need to make sure that I'm properly securing that data. Now, under PCI, bit more specific, we're talking about cardholder data. So your account number and your expiration date and the code on the back of your card, things of that nature. So that's a bit more specific in scope, but GDPR is a bit more broad. So if you are running a business and you do feel like you have to fall within GDPR guidelines, then let's be sure that you are making sure that you are knowing what type of data is being accessed or submitted all across your online presence. How do we protect that cardholder data or even data in general? Well, a couple ways to go about that. And again, I'll go briefly into sort of the things that you need to do, but I mentioned this just now, right? PCI is a bit more specific in scope because it's just one piece of information that I have as an individual. But if the information that I have in terms of my account number is breached, meaning I have a PCI breach, that does automatically mean I'm in breach under GDPR. And if you're aware about GDPR breaches and those consequences, the fines are heavy. And so you don't want to be at risk of, bottoming out the business just because you didn't properly, essentially, dot the I's and cross your T's. Here's a couple of guidelines in terms of protecting cardholder data. It's quite a bit, so that's why it's a good thing we always like to share these presentations so you can sort of store and read it through later. But I'll go through some of the key ones so you have a better understanding of what the intent here and what we're looking to accomplish. The second one I think is one that's really important, one that I try to hammer home all the time, which is providing access to the data only to those intended to access it. So something I touched on earlier, right? Sysadmins or data protection officers may have access to certain parts of the data that they need. Clerks, marketing managers may not. And so we want to make sure the access to that data is only issued to those who absolutely need it. talking this again on monitoring your access to those systems and to the data itself, right? Who accessed what, when, and where. Make sure that you have permission changes audited, and so that if you can identify unauthorized personnel who may have made those changes, whether it was malicious in intent or accidental. Depending on how large your organization is, making sure you have a workflow that then alerts to a designated data protection officer, right? This is a new role this year that people are generating in response to a lot of the new security measures taken in place in terms of protecting data. So whether it is a DPO or another sysadmin or administrator of some type, so that they are alerted in the event that there is a potential problem, right? Anything that does seem suspicious, they should know about. Wherever it is that you're keeping your data should absolutely remain encrypted, okay? Meaning it shouldn't be readable to anyone that just goes in and grabs it. Encryption is going to be a big key, and encryption is one of the things you have to hit in terms of making sure you are compliant with both sets of regulations, all right? From here, we also want to touch on in the event that something goes wrong. Now, I know we're here, we think your business won't get touched, you're small, who would want to hurt you? Ultimately, those types of factors don't play in the security landscape now, because a website that may have just gotten deployed and gone live yesterday may get hacked today. Just as likely as a site that's been on for 20 years and never seen a problem, and all of a sudden, boom, they get hacked. So, who you are, how big you are not going to be things that you should weigh in terms of whether or not you should prepare for the worst. Very likely, you're going to face an incident at some point, no matter how big or small you are. So what should we do? What kind of plan do we come up with in the event that the worst occurs, right? It's not about if, it's more about when. This is a pinwheel that I sort of modified by looking online that I really gravitated toward, because I think it really does sort of simplify it for you as either the business owner or the webmaster in terms of making sure you do have the proper procedures in place to respond in the event of an incident. So first things first, response, okay? Site's hacked, you're concerned about a breach. You have to make sure then in that case you're responding. What does that mean? Well, if you're hacked, that means you got to get it cleaned up. So whether that is you've already generated steps to have someone internally take care of the hack, or whether you don't have the team or personnel for that, then you reach an outside vendor. You have their number, you have someone in contact that you can reach out to and say, hey, my site's been hacked, I need help. The sooner, of course, the sooner you have a plan like this in place, the less time goes by and you need to discover this person in the event that you do need to lean on a third-party vendor. So responding to it, making sure you get the immediate issue cleaned up, and then making whatever analysis or audits are necessary to sort of make sure you get the information you need to know what happened. Recovery. Recovery here sort of is a byproduct of your response, but recovery as well means making sure that you are getting up and making clear transparency available to your base about an issue. If you're trying to comply with GDPR, you should know that you have to, alert to a potential breach within 72 hours of notice. So making sure that part of that recovery process is brand recovery as well. So, being forthright and quick will pay a lot of dividends versus disguising a breach and uncovering that 6 months later, right? Seeing a lot of that in the news lately. Recovery as well, though, could be understanding that you do have a response plan in place. Suppose the hack was clean, but then it corrupted a lot of the core files or custom modifications you made beyond repair. If you have a backup in place, then you can recover the files database that way as well. Review is a bit more, post-incident, and making sure that we understand, okay, what happened, what files are modified, what are all the proper touch points in place in terms of access, whom had it. I touched on the idea of a plugin that may all of a sudden have incidentally generated global write access, meaning anybody can just make modifications where they see fit. Understanding where the issues lie, or essentially where the improvements need to be, are really important. Then the last step, of course, as part of that is mitigation. So, okay, we understand what happened. We understand where we need to improve. So are these tasks that we handle internally? Do we need to reach out to someone else? Did we identify that we had really bad data visibility? So there are a lot of companies out there that do a lot in terms of data analysis and auditing to alert you to issues. So these are the types of steps in place that you have. And it's a pinwheel because remember, this isn't a static state of things, right? These things are always changing. All the improvements you make yesterday in response and then pushing those improvements through won't necessarily mean that you won't get hacked again. And so when you do get hacked again, you continue this process all over again. You respond, you recover, review, and mitigate. So it's simple in nature, and the more you sort of put this to practice across your team, it's going to be really easy for you to identify deficiencies even on a day-to-day basis. So I want to leave, before I wrap up, on this particular note, right? After a crisis, and this was something a director from Northbridge Financial wrote, after a crisis, 1 in 4 businesses will never reopen. Then that's a pretty high percentage, right? 25% of businesses do not reopen. So having a proper business continuity and having a disaster plan in place can help small businesses avoid that fate. It ultimately begins with asking yourself, if I were to experience a loss tomorrow, what would I do? And you don't want to get caught answering that question with, I don't know, or I'm not sure, right? That's really the principle behind having this disaster recovery plan. Because if at worst you do face a crisis or an incident, you do know what to do, right? You know exactly who to talk to and who to reach out to get it done. So just to sort of hit it in more plain text, right? Know whom to contact to remediate immediately you do face a compromise. Recover by, of course, informing your customers in a timely fashion. If, of course, you have to be sure to do so. Of course, that'll pay a lot of dividends in your brand, and customers feel like, okay, well, they were very forthcoming, and that was a quick response out of them, knowing how quickly I got that response out. Execute backups if need be. Review your existing strategy to identify improvements, and of course, make those changes once you do identify them to continue to minimize your risk and minimize your exposure. Notice I wrote minimize. You're not eliminating it, okay? Risk will never be zero in this space, and the best you can do is always just have a plan in place to ensure that we're doing all we can to get that as close to zero as possible. Okay? So there's a lot more detail in which how to properly transcribe a disaster recovery plan, what specific questions need to be asked internally. I actually will be putting out a blog post soon in the coming weeks about exactly what you can do to provide a very thorough disaster recovery plan across the team so everyone's on the same page. And you can find that blog post on this link here at https://blog.sucuri.net. Of course, if you do end up choosing to use us as a service to help facilitate these needs in terms of being proactive and having visibility over your site, one thing we do want to make sure that we're clear about, of course, is that we're also committed to the protection of your data as well. So when GDPR came into effect, something to make note is, of course, but we were compliant. For those that don't know, we made several upgrades to our products, our workflows to ensure that we supported the proper data practices internally. And if you do need a data processing addendum to keep on record, just email us at gdpr@sucuri.net as well for any questions or concerns you may have. Beyond that, time for questions. I hope to have all the answers you need, but otherwise, Val, let me know what we have.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Victor. We do have some questions. Unfortunately, because the time is pretty advanced, we're gonna just go through a few of them.
Sure.
The first one that showed up actually at the moment you started talking about HTTPS was, should I have a HTTPS/SSL? I'm assuming they ask about SSL certificate. If I use a third-party payment processor like PayPal with a hosted page.
So you should, and realistically, it's only because Google is going to make a very large effort to encourage the use of HTTPS, right? It'll prove, as it is now, a positive ranking factor. So from an SEO perspective, you'll see some benefits there. But there are just going to be there are going to be things that'll happen incidentally where you decide to say collect email and names because you want to push out a newsletter. Well, if you're collecting an email and a name, and you're not on an HTTPS already, that's going to be a risk. And Google Chrome is going to flag that type of thing. So if you're accepting any information over HTTP and not without a certificate in place, you're going to see some issues there. So payment-wise, you could be using something like PayPal or another vendor like that. But I would still encourage the use of HTTPS because you may just in the moment decide to collect information, and all of a sudden, browser may not trust your site to be accessible to visitors worldwide.
Yep. So Mike, you heard the man. Use HTTPS.
Yes, sir.
Next one is, what if we're a small team and aren't capable of having a data protection officer? What to do then?
So two things, right? If you're a small team, a lot of, you might have already designated somebody on the team to sort of look over security aspects. Ask them to see if they're willing to at least be that point of contact internally in the event that there's an issue. If not, look for third-party resources, right? Whether you might have a couple of different vendors serving different tasks in terms of data auditing, breach assessment, or in our case, visibility over your files and mitigation through our WAF. That's where you start to look at third-party resources until they become an extension of your team. So that would be my advice to you.
Okay, next one. What's the best way to communicate with our customers if we are the webmasters about using certain plugins, like, for example, WordPress plugins?
So in a case like that, right? So if you're the webmaster, developing a new client site for your client, be upfront with them ultimately, right? So if they start suggesting or noticing, hey, I was going through the repository and I found this really cool plugin I want to use for my site. Can you make it work? Let them, review it. Let them know, look, as much as I know you love it, as much as I want to make you happy, this is going to be a pretty big risk for us because I can't vouch for the fact that they've ever updated this thing. So I don't know if this is going to be vulnerable to any potential hacks or exploits. So why don't we put this aside and try to find something that'll serve the same purpose? You want to stress the risk. And I think business owners and site owners are going to understand that when you start talking that way, it's because you have their best interest in place. So, establishing that trust up front will then, essentially pay dividends down the line, where if you're saying no to a request of theirs, they know where you're coming from, right? And then there's not going to be too much back and forth on it.
Yeah, so going back to the SSL question, we have another one. Actually, I think it's a follow-up of the first one. Do I need a special type of SSL certificate for my e-commerce shop? Can you recommend a provider?
Providers in terms of who would be a good certificate authority to reach out to, that's in a lot of ways going to be more about the time you have and the budget you have. And I couldn't speak to one specific that you can use. Let's Encrypt is a good free alternative if you don't have the means to purchase one. There's some of the known authorities out there. But in terms of having a specific one, that's going to be really just preference on your part, right? You have extended validated certificates, EVSSLs, as you might see, that help in, let's say, displaying your company name within the browser. So, you might see if you go on PayPal, you see PayPal.com, other sites like that. When you see that, they're paying more for a certificate that'll establish that, and the browsers will display that. But a standard certificate like the type Let's Encrypt has, or the type that GoDaddy issues, those are going to be sufficient. They're going to get the job done. Browsers will still produce the green padlock. The only real recommendations I have are really just not to use a self-signed one, okay? Because you're just going to run into problems there.
Yeah, that's good to know. Do we always need to have backups as part of our disaster recovery, and why?
Yes. Oh my God, yes. I was actually I was speaking to a gentleman on Monday evening, actually, who he's on a shared hosting platform, a popular host, and he had about 60 sites that were impacted. Don't know if he's even on this webinar. Perhaps I invited him, but he faced a big incident, right? So it started with 3 sites, spread to about 15, and it basically hit his entire environment. He was looking for some affordable options, and I know part of the discussion I had with him as well, if you have backups in place, do it. And he told me, yeah, he did have backups in place, and he did roll back to them, but then he found out the backups were corrupted. So yes, you absolutely need backups, because you'll need it in a case like that in some cases. But on top of that, and we actually have had webinars and blog posts on this too, you want to make sure the backups work. And beyond that, back up those backups, right? It sounds silly, but in nature, you want to make sure that every layer is functional, because you just don't know if one of those layers fail on you. and then you're left like this gentleman was, sort of grasping at straws because he thought he could solve his problem with just this one layer of backups on his host side, which just because they were living alongside those infected files, it was all corrupted, right? And a quick note on that, if you are going to use backups, make sure they're off-site, right? So you're using another vendor, or they're in the cloud somewhere away from where your files, your production files may be impacted.
Yeah, that's a good thing you mentioned the conversation. I remember once at an event, somebody asking about backups, and we said, okay, so what is the most recent backup you did? And you're like, yeah, yesterday. I'm like, cool. Did you test it?
Yeah.
And his face, was worth all the money. Like, test it? Why should I test a backup? Because you don't know if it rolls back.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe two more questions, and then we're off. Is it important in terms of being PCI compliant to have the security solution also certified? Does anyone check for these?
In terms of if we are also certified, well, it depends on what context you're asking the question. I will take a guess at that, though. We are a level 1 PCI provider designated service. So if you just need for auditing purposes or AOC that certifies that, just reach out to our team. We're on our live chat or info@sucuri.net, or you can reach me directly. I have my email right there. And we can provide that and into making sure that you're compliant and you're using services that are compliant. So I'm going to assume that's the context of the question. Otherwise, email me if you had something more specific in mind.
Yeah, for sure. The last one we have here, I think that's going to be easy to respond, because the question is, can we get some examples of e-commerce sites using your protection services? And I'm going to send you all listening, and whoever's going to watch the recording, to sucuri.net/customers. That's where you will have a lot of filters that you can filter out, e-commerce provider, many categories that you can pick from, and see who already uses our services. And of course, feel free to reach out to them, ask them how the solution works, how satisfied they are, and that's going to be one easy way to check.
Yeah. It's very straightforward, and you'll also get a good context for what drove them to come to us and what specific issues they were facing, and because in some cases they may mirror yours. So it's actually a really good place to go.
Yeah, they could have the same issue that you are facing right now. Yeah, that should be it. Actually, we're a bit 3 minutes over the 30 minutes we wanted to go for. Thank you so much, Victor, again for the 5th webinar. I'm going to give you a hand here. And thank you, everyone, for watching. I'm just going to repeat this again for anybody joining us later. We will be having this recording available in a few days on our website, and also we will be publishing the slides that Victor used. And of course, feel free to reach out to Victor if you have any specific questions for him regarding any of the things you heard here. I'm going to say goodbye now. I'm going to let Victor say it, and then we're just going to meet again on the next webinar. Thank you.
No, my pleasure, guys. And as I mentioned, any questions at all or follow-ups you have, my email's right there. I am open to all. So by all means, reach out. I'll be happy to answer.